You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. So I have a great one for you this week. As everyone hearing my voice has seen and heard, the conversations around menopause hormone therapy, MHT, HRT, HT, whatever initials you prefer, have been evolving at breakneck speed since we launched the show in the fall of 2020. And the landscape is now super confusing. Scroll through any menopause social media feed, and you'll see messages that hormone therapy will reduce your risk of dying prematurely by a third, and it'll cut your risk of heart disease by half, and many similar statistics. And there's a lot of promising research out there. But then you turn around and you look at the guidelines from medical bodies like the Menopause Society and the American Heart Association, and pretty much all the governing bodies, and they clearly state that they do not recommend hormone therapy for the prevention of chronic diseases like heart disease, stroke, cancer, and dementia. And it is 100% natural to throw up your hands and be like, what the hell is going on? I do it almost daily. And objectively, I can see what's going on. For one, often the statistics are presented in relative, not absolute risk, which we'll talk about in a bit, but relative risk is almost always more dramatic sounding. And also, importantly, the research landscape is just incredibly messy. Hormone therapy is not one thing. Peri and menopausal women are not a monolith. They are not one thing. Women in early or surgical menopause often have different needs and outcomes than those going through the transition later. Severe menopausal symptoms, especially vasomotor symptoms, are correlated with increased risk of chronic diseases like heart disease. So those women may have different outcomes than a woman who is not having severe or even moderate symptoms. But the messages we hear often lump all these women together. Also, there are myriad forms and formulations and doses of estrogen therapy and estrogen and progesterone or progestogen therapy, and we're just beginning to parse all that out insofar as the effects both short and long term. So it's a lot. And throw in testosterone, which is increasingly being added into the mix, and we'll also talk about in the show, and it's a lot. And to be 100% clear, there is zero doubt that the risks of hormone therapy were overblown and that hormone therapy is a lifesaver for millions of women. And far too many women have been denied care and are still being denied care. I think every woman should be able to have an educated conversation with her doctor about hormone therapy when she hits the transition, if not before. As we have heard on this show far too many times, it's way too hard for too many women to have those conversations and get the care they need. Full stop. It's ludicrous. Where the water is becoming muddier is if hormone therapy is a longevity or health span tool for women broadly. Whether or not we should all be taking it as a matter of course, even if we're otherwise healthy or don't have symptoms. And those are conversations I'm having on the regular now because in many circles, that's becoming the implication. So I really just wanted to sit down and talk to someone who's had their boots on the ground for decades, immersed in the research, who could talk about where we've been and what we know about hormone therapy and what it can do for women in peri and postmenopause, and pretty much all of it. And I was really thrilled to have this conversation with Professor Susan Davis. Professor Davis has many initials behind her name, including PhD as well as AO, which is an Officer of the Order of Australia, which she was recently awarded for being a pioneer and leading expert in women's health as a clinical endocrinologist and researcher and educator. She has literally decades of experience as a clinical researcher with specific expertise in sex hormones in women across the lifespan. Her research spans basic science to clinical trials, and she has been pivotal in our understanding of how sex hormones impact the brain, cardiovascular system, and other tissues like fat, muscle, joint cartilage, and bone. She is the past president of the Australasian Menopause Society and the International Menopause Society. She has over 435 peer-reviewed publications, has received numerous national and international prestigious research awards, and just 2 years ago, in 2022, she was awarded the Medal of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians for her outstanding contribution and leadership in endocrinology and women's health. I could go on and on here, but you get the idea. She has been steeped in the subject for a very, very long time, and she cut through a lot of the confusion, which I really, really appreciated. And if I'm honest, she also raised more questions because we are always going to have more questions. That's how science works. It is iterative and never settled, which I get it, man. It can be unsettling because we all want answers and we all want to take care of ourselves the very best ways we can. And for many of us, that's going to mean hormone therapy. And of course, if you're having symptoms, it's the gold standard treatment for many of them. But you shouldn't feel pressured to take hormone therapy if you don't feel like you need it. And I know many women do. Because when it comes to general health, there are lots of ways to take care of yourself. And while some women do brilliantly with hormone therapy, others don't. Some want it, some don't. In the end, we all need to make up our minds on where we fall there. And we have to make those decisions that we feel are best for ourselves, knowing that there's plenty that we still don't know. And I also feel like we should make those decisions with as much nuanced information as possible. And we should understand that the statistics we hear from one study aren't necessarily found in another. And as I mentioned before, we so often hear about risk and risk reductions in terms of relative risk instead of absolute risk. And I know that sounds really, really wonky, but it's also really important. So Peter Attia did a really great post on this. I'll drop it in the show notes, but really quickly, he puts it this way. When you hear, say, like a new drug reduces cancer incidence by 50%, that's relative risk. But that doesn't really tell you is what the risk was to begin with. Absolute risk puts it in more perspective. So in this case, it could be that this new drug reduced cancer risk from 2 people per 1,000 to 1 person per 1,000. That's a 50% decrease, but it lands differently when you hear it that way. Likewise, you often hear statistics from observational studies, which are useful for sure, but they are considered less scientifically definitive than randomized control trials. And all of that is nuance, and that nuance gets way lost in our social media universe. So I hope this conversation helps bring that nuance, puts things in perspective. I know it also creates more questions, but I really do hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. All right, I have talked a lot, so I'll just get right to it here. If you're looking for more education on all things menopause, come on and join us for our fall session of Navigate Menopause, where we have 8 weeks of meeting together and going through nutrition, hormones, hormone therapy, mindset, symptoms, training, so much more. You can sign up at feistymenopause.com. Super quick thanks to Tifosi Optics for helping bring these kind of conversations your way. They are great sports and casual shades for whatever your outdoor activities, and I appreciate their support. And with that, let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. Okay, Professor Davis, I am over the moon that you are joining me today to maybe help calm the waters a little bit, or at least shine some light on the waters on this conversation. I would really just like to set the stage for our show talking about where we are with hormone therapy at the moment, and then segue into what your team is studying regarding testosterone, because I think that's really, really interesting and important work. And also, woo, the Wild West in the menopause space right now. So let me just set the stage on my end of things. So when I started the show in 2020, the online conversation was very, very different about hormone therapy. And we have seemed to have swung pretty wildly from like, I don't know, I'm a little afraid of that to I'm afraid to not use it. And you did a great masterclass on Simon Hill's The Proof, which I'd like to just set the stage and explore a little bit. And you said about the same thing. You said women now are getting this message online that everyone should be on hormones and hormones fix everything. And to be clear, I've always been of the mind that every woman does not need to be on hormone therapy. It's a great tool. It's very helpful. But here is where I'm going to be very transparent, and here's where I really do struggle. because I have spent, the past several years going to the Menopause Society meetings, in the literature, reading all the books. And as you presented on Hill's show, even women with no symptoms can lose 6% of their bone, cholesterol can change, central abdominal fat can increase 20 to 40%, cardiovascular disease risk rises, diabetes risk rises. And the studies do seem to indicate that women who take hormone therapy have less waist circumference increases and central abdominal fat gain. It does help prevent fracture. We know that. It appears cardioprotective. But in the very same breath, the guidelines will say it is not indicated for primary or secondary prevention of cardiovascular or other chronic disease. And the natural question, Professor Davis, is why? Like, why not?
Okay, wow, there's a lot in that. Where do I start to answer that? So let's tick a couple of boxes that are true.
Okay.
Our data corresponds to data from other countries in which people are predominantly of European ancestry, because there are some differences in cultures in the experience of menopause for women of different ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And that data shows that about a third of the women will have moderate to severe hot flushes, night sweats, mood swings, etc. So the classic symptoms of a fall in estrogen in a woman. And the primary indication for hormone therapy is still for symptom relief. So that sort of ticks that box. That is the clearest indication that if you've got symptoms that are really making your life very unpleasant, or even making your life hell, then it's quite reasonable and appropriate, unless there's a particular indication, like contraindication, like breast cancer, etc., we would recommend hormone therapy. Then you raise the very valid point that, well, even without symptoms, women will tend to lose bone. So on average, women will lose 6 to 8% of their bone as they go through the menopause. Bone loss is much more likely if you're slim compared to being overweight or obese. And the problem is we can't predict who are going to be the losers. So it's an average loss. It doesn't mean every woman's going to lose 6 to 8%. That's an average. Some women lose very little bone across the menopause, and some women lose even more. And so my rule of thumb is a woman comes to talk to me about their menopause transition. They've got the classic symptoms. I treat them. If they then do not have the classic symptoms, I will then say, well, hey, you're now a year or so into, since you've had a period or since we think all this has started, why don't we check your bone density? And then I will see if the bone density is an indication for someone to go on therapy. If their bone density is tending towards the lower side, we use the term osteopenic before it gets to osteoporosis. So they're on the lower side than we would expect. Have the conversation, well, maybe we should use some estrogen to protect your bones dropping even further. If in fact the bone density is pretty good, I might then say, well, how about repeating this in 2 years? If it's not changing, we're not going to worry. If it's changing, that would be an indication for considering hormones to protect you against this silent bone loss, because bone loss is silent.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's sort of fairly straightforward. And we have developed what's called the Practitioner Toolkit for Managing Menopause. It's free online. It's endorsed by international societies and most Australian medical societies. And for the first time in that, we've actually put guidance for women who are postmenopausal with osteopenia, when estrogen should be added, because there's clear guidance for osteoporosis, but there's this woolly guidance for osteopenia. At what point should you worry? So we've put in some guidelines there, and anyone can download that for free on the
I'll
internet.
put it in the show notes, and I really appreciate that, because here in the States, at least, the recommendation is age 65, and it makes me very upset. Like, we need to be looking at women's bones before that.
Yes. So where we've put in that, we've started at the beginning and said, okay, this group of people absolutely should have a bone density done. So, for example, if you've had an overactive thyroid, or you've got malabsorption, or you've got various things, you should have a bone density. Then there's a group of people where if a bone density can be done, it would be optimal.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be people in women of normal to low body weight, women who are smokers. So where there's a greater, it's not an absolute categorically urgently must do, but boy, if you could do it, would probably be preferred. And then you've got women who they've got no risk factors, and it just might be their personal choice to spend the money. And then it goes on to say, okay, what do you do with the result?
Yeah.
And it's an algorithm beyond that. So that's the bone bit easily dealt with. But I think the interesting part's the cardiovascular.
Mm.
And as you've correctly said, that cardiovascular risk factors change as women go through menopause. Again, it's not every woman. Not every woman gains abdominal fat. Not every woman's cholesterol changes. But overall, there is a trend that women will start to get more abdominal fat. The cholesterol levels will go up. In a small subgroup of women, blood pressure might change, but that's a more less common thing. And estrogen does help blood vessels stay healthy. So when you go through menopause and estrogen drops, blood vessel function becomes less optimal. So therefore, why don't we have the screaming evidence that estrogen protects against cardiovascular disease? And the evidence is not strong. I mean, if you actually look at the Women's Health Initiative study, using estrogen plus progestogen did not prevent cardiovascular disease, but it did not increase it. It was a neutral effect. And if you go out to the 13-year and 18-year follow-up, it's completely neutral, even for women up to the age of 70. In the estrogen-only study, there appeared as though even at 13 years, there was a small significant reduction in cardiovascular disease and even deaths from cardiovascular disease. But then if you look at the sub-analysis in that study of women who'd not used estrogen before the study, there was no protection. So if there is a protection against cardiovascular disease, the number you would need to treat to get some small benefits actually quite large. You'd have to be putting a hell of a lot of women on HRT to get a benefit. The other thing is that how much is that benefit was due to the type of estrogen used, and is that benefit seen with other estrogens? So back in 1997, we published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that conjugated estrogens, which is from pregnant mare's urine, is almost as effective as statins in lowering cholesterol in postmenopausal women with high cholesterol. But when we repeated that study in women with using estrogen patches, we didn't see the same benefit. So not all delivery systems of estrogen are going to give the same outcomes. And in fact, we really don't have data that estrogen through the skin as a patch or a gel actually prevents heart disease. So to stand on a soapbox and say everybody should be on estrogen to prevent heart disease is not based on a very sound data basis.
Thank you for that clarification. That is one of the things that, as I indicated in some of the questions I sent you ahead of time, I feel like the waters are so muddy when people talk about this, because they are talking about a body of research that includes women who have uteruses, women who don't have uteruses, women who are using estrogen only combined therapy, different forms of formulations of estrogen and doses of estrogen. And I mean, it's my Lord. And that, so while we are talking about that, because you segued really well into, I would love to get your insights on research that keeps getting cited over and over here. You know, you see HRT significantly reduces all-cause mortality and cardio heart disease by 30% to 50%. HRT reduces cardiovascular disease by 50%. And that's all coming from that study, Menopausal Hormone Replacement Therapy and Reduction of All-Cause Mortality and Cardiovascular Disease. It's about time and timing. But when you dig into it, like I see that, again, like not all the randomized controlled trials are there. What do you think about these kind of statistics being put out there?
I can cherry pick the statistics and present a story of whatever you want to see. That's the problem. And
Yeah.
and when we do, at medical conferences, we often do debates, and we often just debate a side different. I mean, if you cherry pick the literature, you can find an argument for almost anything. And going just back to the question, what's been shown, if you really want to prevent cardiovascular disease in women, you treat hypertension, which is mostly poorly and undertreated. You stop women smoking, particularly in the young years, but also older years. And I know smoking's less today than previously, but there's still a lot of women who smoke. You have women exercising, and you improve nutrition and diet. And, our nutrition is, if you look at the average American nutrition, it's probably worse than the average Australian nutrition. So much processed food, lifestyle trumps whether if you we wouldn't be just arguing or discussing academically about does estrogen prevent heart disease if it was the bleeding obvious.
Right.
If the
No.
data was so clear, like, does anyone argue that smoking causes lung cancer or that smoking causes cardiovascular disease? We don't. It is so black and white. But the effects of hormones on cardiovascular disease in terms of outcomes and mortality, if it was so black and white, it would be dramatic. But it really tinkers around the edges. And we should really be focusing on the big tickets that will change cardiovascular risk. And as I said, blood pressure, smoking, not being overweight or obese, not eating, poor quality food. All of these things are what matter.
Yeah, and this is a very active audience, so that they're ticking that box at least. And we do talk about processed food, and that's another show for another time. A lot of us eat a lot of junk when we're out there running marathons and doing long bike rides. But hopefully, eat your whole foods, friends. Keep
Yeah,
keep your whole foods.
takes time to prepare, but whatever. But I'm just saying, if it was so clear cut,
I
we
hear
wouldn't be
you.
having a conversation.
Yeah.
And the effect size, if there is a true statistical effect size, it is small. And you've got to but balance it against, I think, as you say, it's a mishmash of information, different formulations, different age group women, different studies, different environments, healthy user effects, it's
Yeah.
complex, and we don't have the black and white answers that people want to hear.
Yeah, it is really complicated, and it's so interesting to me that you said that about, because when I was looking into the literature on um cholesterol specifically, oral conjugated estrogens, like you mentioned, definitely seem to have, because they have that first pass liver effect. So they did have the benefit there. And it's interesting because I've heard some podcasters out there saying, well, we should just throw the WHI data out because nobody uses that anymore. But meaning nobody uses those formulations anymore. But like, it's important because of what you're talking about here.
Well, I mean, there is some evidence that, for example, in the Women's Health Initiative study, that showed that conjugated estrogens only were associated with a lower rate of breast cancer.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be seen with other estrogen formulations. So it is, and there are some animal studies, some rodent studies that suggest that there's something about the conjugated estrogens, which is a mixture of a whole lot of so estrogen cocktail,
Like more than
but
50, they said, right? At the
well, a large number, and
Yeah.
I've heard all sorts of numbers quoted, but so pregnant mare's urine, which is converted into conjugated estrogens, which is was used in the Women's Health Initiative, is a cocktail of hormones, and it might be that that has something in it that protects against breast cancer, which is not seen with estrogen only therapy when it's just pure estradiol. So I think it's really dangerous to keep generalizing and extrapolating from these situations. It's complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated. And before we leave that, I'm curious, what do we understand about estrogen? estrogen only versus estrogen plus micronized progesterone. S- I guess my real question is sometimes I wonder if the difference we're seeing is because of the population that those formulations are used in. You know, you're talking about women who have early, they're surgical versus like a natural menopause down the road.
Yeah, well, I mean, the estrogen only study in Women's Health Initiative program, if I remember correctly, something like 45% of those women had had their ovaries removed, not just a hysterectomy. So you're comparing apples and pears
Yeah.
in terms of the populations. So it might be something different that if you've got a population of which a significant proportion have had both ovaries removed and had a surgical menopause, maybe hormone therapy is completely different in them, and it's nothing to do whether or not you're on a progestogen. That's why we've got to be very careful about the generalizations. So a lot's being said about, you must have transdermal therapy and you must have micronized progesterone because this is all more natural, but maybe it's not better. We don't know.
Yes, and I'm sympathetic. I have to say I'm very sympathetic to women because I feel like, of course, they want the answers now, you know, and the answers are not here now. So when people speak very like I have the answer and it is this, it's very tempting, right? It's very tempting to listen to that. But I always just encourage people like science is iterative and we don't like there's a lot we don't know. I mean, and we won't talk about brain health. That's a whole other podcast and I've done it. But that's a very sticky wicket too, right? I mean, I think Lisa Mosconi is doing amazing work, but there's no way that you can definitively say every woman should be on estrogen so she doesn't get dementia.
Well, you see, I don't think the evidence is there to even say that at all. And I think the evidence to suggest that even going on estrogen, I've heard it said that going on estrogen early, even in the late 40s will make difference. The data's not there. We have done studies in women with early menopause, well, within the early period of menopause, and found no benefit of giving estrogen on complex cognitive tasks. I think I think no one should be taking estrogen purely to prevent cognitive decline because the data's not there. And
So
our brain cells in petri dishes.
yeah, well that is a fact. And I do that's why I mean it's her work, the Dr. Mosconi I'm talking specifically, is so intriguing to me because she is doing, you know, these but she says all the time too that this indicates more work. This indicates we need more study in this area. You know, she is clear about
It,
that.
yeah, we can go
To
down rabbit holes there.
oh boy, yeah, we can. But I do want to, you know, you said something on Simon Hill's show that also kind of landed with me and made me go, okay, but then now what? You know, you said it's not necessarily natural that we're living to be 90s, you know, and our hormones were never designed to carry us through our 80s and 90s and beyond. That is like, you said that very clearly. But many of us are living that long. I have, you know, my great grandmother lived to be over 100. Um, so then I go, well, then I live am I doomed? You know, like it sort of leaves you feeling that way, right? Like, well, if my hormones weren't designed to this, but I'm outliving what my hormones were designed, shouldn't I just put those hormones back? I mean, it does seem like 1 + 2 = 3.
She wasn't taking hormones to 100, I bet.
No, she wasn't.
And I mean, if you look at the populations where there's longevity, they're not taking hormones. It's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on. And I don't think, thinking hormones are going to be the quick fix is obvious. You know, there's genetics and there's environmental factors, and definitely some women benefit by hormones, but it's not about longevity. All
Hmm.
the other things in our environment and our lifestyle and our, as I said, our nutrition, our general health, our psychological well-being. I mean, if I'm correct in remembering, in the communities where people do live to quite aged years, there's a lot of positive community strength and a positive socialization.
Big deal. Hmm.
There are so many things. I mean, we did a study years ago of cognitive function, and one of the biggest predictors of poorer cognitive function, even in younger women, was living alone. So community and connectivity and socialization are part of good health. And I think we tend to forget that and just think hormones, hormones, hormones.
Yeah. Yeah, I had on a neuroscientist who said the exact same thing. She's like, we've taken estrogen and we've made it the biggest weight on the scale. And she's like, it's not the biggest weight on the scale when you're talking about.
No, so many things,
Yeah.
so many factors contribute to cognitive health.
I would like to rewind in the conversation just a bit and talk about, the menopause transition period, especially as women get to that place where everything is kind of chaos for them. They're in that sort of like hormonal chaos period. And when I listened to your masterclass on Simon Hill, I was like, oh, this makes sense. We have a group of about 31,000 women. It's a complimentary Facebook group for this podcast. And I hear all the time women in that period who are, getting hormone therapy and sort of struggling with it. Like sometimes they feel worse. Sometimes it's not, they're manipulating the doses and turning the dials. And, you had mentioned that when the hormones are swinging, it's tricky to treat because sometimes you can make their symptoms worse because they might have a lot of estrogen going on right now. So can you talk a bit about that for a little clarity?
Okay, so the normal menstrual cycle is a very predictable roller coaster of hormones. We know that estrogen eases up until, or increases gradually until ovulation, drops a little bit, a second little peak during the last part of the cycle, and then drops and you bleed. Whereas progesterone is low and increases after ovulation, like a little hilltop coming up and then comes down. So we have these natural undulations of hormones during the menstrual cycle that in a woman having a predictable 28, 30, 32-day cycle repeats the same pattern over and over again. Get to menopause and the undulations become chaos. And if you were to track daily hormone levels, they're up and down like a yo-yo. So if you then layer on hormones on top of that, all you're doing is exaggerating the peaks and maybe softening out the troughs. But so sometimes when you get the peaks, when you get the full breasts and the bloating and irritability, you're adding more hormones to make that worse.
Mm.
You might soften the troughs, but what's happened is that you've put in some more hormones. And then if ovulation does occur, then suddenly bleeding might be worse. So you can basically amplify the symptoms and make some of the symptoms worse by just layering. It's just like putting a thick layer of icing on a cake. Or you're just amplifying at different times. So I have always found that a very challenging period of time to help a woman. And in fact, my approach in general is to try and flatline the hormones. So it is a time where we have different things available in Australia to what's available in other countries. So a classic thing I would do if there were no contraindications, I would put a woman on an oral contraceptive pill that contains estradiol, just like HRT. So
Hmm.
for example, we have 2 oral contraceptive pills in Australia that instead of containing synthetic ethinyl estradiol, contain estradiol. So women get just like a constant hormone level. They get bleeding cycle control, they get contraception, and they get a constant even estrogen dose. And we do that really commonly. And then for women who can't take oral estrogen, for example, women who get migraines with aura or who've had a thrombosis, etc., we will give them instead a progestin-only pill that contains a hormone called drospirenone. But unlike the mini pill, this particular pill switches off ovulation. And then we give them a patch or some gel to top them up with some estrogen. So the point is that we switch off the ovarian chaos,
Right.
flatline the hormones in a very even way, and wait for ovaries to go through the transition. And then after 12, 18, 24 months, have a break and see what's going on. But adding more fuel to the fire, but just by throwing hormones at a very chaotic time, often does harm.
And so women are clear. Why doesn't traditional hormone therapy have that same effect?
Because after a woman's gone through the menopause, we have a visitor just coming in the room. They've gone.
No problem.
While once women have gone through the menopause and have become postmenopausal, the ovaries produce very subliminal amounts of anything. So the hormones we're giving are basically the major hormones a woman's body's going to see.
And then for people who are trying to use traditional hormone therapy in that perimenopausal period where you're talking about, which is very frequently used, like a more oral contraceptive route. Why doesn't traditional hormone therapy work in that same way? Is the dose too low?
Oh, why doesn't traditional hormone therapy is not contraceptive? It does not switch off ovarian function.
Right,
So
that's what I want to clear.
you're giving hormones often in a cycle to induce a bleed, and then the ovaries start working, and then you get another bleed. And then you feel terrible because you've got all these hormones on board. You've got the stuff you're taking and the
Right.
stuff your ovaries making. And it's just like, a mishmash of hormones with
Yeah.
no regularity or control.
Yep. Thank you for that clarification. And then the final clarification, because you speak so beautifully on all this, is boy, hormone testing, hormone balancing, that it's everybody, there's a lot of promises out there. There's a lot of things being sold, but can you please just talk about what women should know about having their hormone levels test and quote unquote balancing their hormones?
Well, firstly, there's no such thing as balancing the hormones. I cannot tell a person what their hormones should be. I mean, it's a complete nonsense because, and the best example is that some women can very effectively and successfully ovulate and conceive with an estradiol level of, we use different units, 500 picomoles per liter, which is probably about, it's divided by 150 picomoles per liter. Now, picograms per mil.
Yeah.
Other women can, in order to successfully ovulate, instead of having 500 picomoles per liter in their blood, they have 1,500 picomoles per liter. I can give an estradiol patch to somebody and their blood estrogen can be 200, and I give the same patch to someone else and their blood estrogen's 500. The one with the level of 200 has their symptoms cured. The one with the level of 500 still got hot flushes and night sweats. I mean, I don't know. Nobody knows what the right dose of hormone is for you. Why is that? Because we're measuring something in the blood. That tells us nothing about what's happening in the cell. The hormone has to, one, get into the cell. And secondly, once it's in the cell, how it will act in the cell will depend on somebody's own personal genetic biology, whatever. So a blood estrogen in me could be great, but in you could either feel overtreated or undertreated. That's the first thing. The second thing is that many of the methods used to test hormones are relatively insensitive.
Mm.
And then the other thing is, even if you look at patches or gels, I've seen original data that, submitted for their FDA or TGA, whatever, or European Medicines approval. Even within a single woman, your absorption changes from day to day.
That makes
So
sense.
one day you could have the same dose every day for a week, and every day taken, the blood drawn at the same time will be different.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And research clearly shows that levels do not correlate with symptoms. I mean, that has been shown again and again and again. And what your receptors are doing and all of that. So I really, really appreciate you uh putting that into
So
words.
No one should be paying money to have their hormones balanced. The only time I do it is that occasionally women simply do not absorb estrogen well through their skin. There's no test that's going to predict who that's going to be, but if a woman says to me, they're on a decent dose of estrogen, patch gel, whatever, and they're still feeling horrible, I will test their estrogen level, not to treat to a level, but occasionally it'll come back. They've got like a 100 microgram patch on, and they've got almost an undetectable estradiol level, and they're just not absorbing it. So it doesn't matter
Mm,
how many patches I throw at them, they're not absorbing it.
yeah,
That's the resistance test.
excellent. Thank you so much for all of that clarification. I would like to segue now into the work you're currently doing on another hormone that is a rising star in this space, I feel like, because everybody's talking about it. You're doing really important work on testosterone that I would love to hear more about. You hear so many women are getting pellets, so many women are exploring this in and themselves. My understanding is you're looking at the role testosterone may play in muscle and bone loss and maybe even protecting the heart. I would love to tell us more about that.
So, I mean, I think it's irrefutable that there is good evidence that testosterone improves sexual interest in women with low sexual interest. It doesn't work on everybody, and it's not a miracle. I mean, I have been giving women testosterone since the mid-80s, initially as pellets, because that's all we had available then. And I constantly hear women say, yes, my libido's improved, but not as much as I expected. It's not like when I was 30,
Right.
So expectations shouldn't be too high. So the effect is modest to moderate. That's the first thing. In terms of mood and well-being, in randomized placebo-controlled trials, we do not see a benefit.
Mm,
So the women often come back and say, oh, my mood's so much better. Well, and my energy is so much better. But partly that's going to be a placebo effect. But we're really interested in muscle and bone because we know that some women will still lose bone even when they get adequate amount of estrogen. And our very old study done in the 90s suggested a significant benefit for bone with testosterone pellets, but other studies have not reproduced that. So we're currently doing a study of women under the age of 55 who are on hormone replacement therapy, and we're adding testosterone or placebo. It's double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, and we're looking at the effects primarily on bone, using a whole lot of different things. We do what's called trabecular bone, QCT scans of the radius, which gives us microarchitecture, and also bone density and body composition. So, and that's a 12-month study. So that's quite important.
it's very
And then
important.
the other question we're interested in is sarcopenia or muscle loss. So from the age of mid-50s, women start to lose muscle, and it's very hard to maintain that muscle. Whether testosterone will protect against that, we don't know. And one of the problems with studying muscle is that the tests for assessing muscle function are very crude. So the classic would be, how far you can walk 6 meters, how fast
Right.
you can walk 6 meters.
Stand
Well, if
and walk.
you know,
Okay, I
health,
can stand up and I can walk.
yeah, or what's called the sit-stand test, with your
Yes.
arms folded across your chest, how many times you can sit stand in a period of time. Well, that's really relevant if you're frail or debilitated. But if you're otherwise a healthy person, it depends what side of the bed you got out that morning, really, or if you did a gym session the night before,
Right.
So they're very crude measures. So we're using quite a sophisticated measure where it's a pressure match, where it really measures force, weight, and very sensitive measures of muscle function and strength. And so we're using sort of computerized tests of muscle function and tests to get strength to get very subtle changes within the normal range for healthy people.
And how far are you into the study at this point?
Oh, we've recruited, we haven't been pushing that too much because we've got all these other studies going on.
Okay.
We've recruited about a third of the people who are going to be in it.
Okay. Okay. So
Watch this space.
I am going to definitely watch the space because I'm keenly interested in that. I crystal ball, do you foresee a day where testosterone becomes more of a standard part of the considerations of hormone therapy for women in menopause?
I don't know that it's just women in menopause. I think we need to understand it. Okay, so our data shows that testosterone levels decline by about 25% between the ages of 18 and 40.
Okay.
And our older data using fairly imprecise measures of testosterone suggests that that decline continues until about the age of 60, completely unaffected by the menopause transition, just a slow decline. And then after bottoming out around the age of 60, it then increases.
I remember reading that. And do we have any idea why?
No. And
Okay.
then what we've got is for women aged 18 to 39 and women aged 70 to 94, thousands of women, we have published data for testosterone measured with great precision, so we can precisely measure the low levels seen in women. So we see this slope down in women from 18 to say 40. And then from 70 onwards, the levels are identical to the women aged 18 to 40, but increase between the age of 70 and 80, and then the rise declines a bit. So we don't understand why women from the age of 70 have the same blood testosterone levels as young women and why they increase. And they not only increase as a group, but when we've had women who have had blood levels taken 3 years apart, in individual women, testosterone increases. So what we've got at the moment is this black hole between 40 and 70 where we haven't measured testosterone with great precision. But we now have blood samples of 1,400 women in that age. And we're at the moment, as I speak, we're measuring testosterone with precision in that age group. So in the next 3 months, we will be reporting what happens between the ages of 40 and 70 with testosterone in women, because right now we don't know.
That's so interesting. I wonder if there's a compensatory like mechanism going on. Like,
We don't know, but it was not what we did not really expect to find such high levels in older women.
yeah.
But you think about it, why does Granny get whiskers?
Well, totally. I mean, when you say that, I'm like, okay, like
So
that I get.
why do women in their 70s and 80s start to say, hey, I've got these dark hairs, I don't like it. They start to get thinning of their hair.
Yeah.
Their testosterone is sort of normalized to premenopausal levels, but we don't know where it dips out, where it really bottoms out, and that's what we're looking at right now. And the reason it's never been done before is you need a population-based study where you've got women who are otherwise healthy and you actually can measure their hormones.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting. And it also, I mean, then you think, well, we don't want to be adding more testosterone to that picture necessarily down the road, right?
Well, we don't
Oh.
understand it. So in women aged 70 to 94, having a testosterone in the bottom 25%
Mm-hmm.
was associated with a twofold greater risk of having a cardiovascular event, a heart attack or a stroke. After adjusting for age, body mass
Yeah,
index,
yeah.
renal, diabetes, blood pressure, etc. So, we're wondering if there's some protective effect of testosterone increasing with age, but we don't know. We don't understand it. And we're trying to. That doesn't mean women should take testosterone. It protect the heart. We're trying to work this out.
Right. I mean, we're treating ourselves like test tubes right now, and people are not test tubes. I always make that point. Like everybody's physiology, it doesn't work that way. You don't just dump things in and expect the same thing. Um, you used to use pellets because that was what you had. What are your thoughts on pellets now?
Well, we used pellets because it's what we had and because they were made by a particular pharmaceutical company under controlled and calibrated and certified circumstances that were approved by the government regulators. And around about 2010, the production was stopped because it was felt that the quality control was no longer as good as it should be, and the commercial interest wasn't as much, so they have to reinvest, so they just stopped the production of the pellets. And since that time, most of the pellets available are compounded. There's a US company that does make pellet, a testosterone pellet approved for men.
Hmm.
That's FDA regulated. But many of the testosterone pellets are used are compounded, so that means they've never been studied to look at what what blood levels do women actually get from these pellets? What's their rate of dissolving? What level do you need? What dose should you use? How often should you use them, etc. So the safety margin's not there. We have the good fortune in Australia that we have a testosterone transdermal cream that's approved by our drug regulated body for use in women.
For women, boy, you
Yeah.
are lucky. We don't
It's
have
been
that here.
Yeah, it's now been approved in South Africa. I think it will be approved in Europe in not too long a time. But the problem is in the US, the FDA have not approved anything. They've had opportunities to approve things, but they've made the bar so ridiculously high. And I'm highly critical of the FDA for this because they just sit back and watch everybody get unregulated, unknown, pharmacokinetically non-established testosterone, and they just wash their hands of it and just say, not our problem.
Yep. And that we will not fix this morning, or this where you are in this evening. But um, thank you so much for sharing your decades of wisdom and research and understanding with us. I really, really appreciate it. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to make clear? Anything you wanted to leave this audience with regard to this topic?
Well, I guess the final thought I'd say is it is a work in progress. There is more unanswered questions than answered questions. I do believe if you're using, not everybody needs hormones. If you do have symptoms, you use the lowest effective dose, but use it as long as you need it. There's no time that you have to stop. Not everybody has to have transdermal estrogen. For some women, it's not the best option. It doesn't alleviate their symptoms and they have to take tablets. And everybody's talking about micronized progesterone as though it's the holy grail. Some women don't tolerate it because of side effects. It makes them too sleepy or too puffy or too bloated. We don't have evidence that it will be adequate to protect the lining of the uterus for women using high-dose estrogen. The data's not there. It's only been studied with 1 milligram of estradiol. There's no data for a 2 milligram tablet. There's no data for a 100 patch. So if you're using higher dose estrogen, you have to make sure that you're getting the lining protected. And I do hear it said that micronized progesterone is so safe it doesn't cause breast cancer. We don't know. And I think it's dangerous to say that, not to frighten women, but just don't assume that there's data where there isn't. And we just don't have the data that micronized progesterone is so much safer than any other progestin, although that's being pushed out a lot. And I don't have shares in any of these companies, so I'm not conflicted to say this. And Just as a disclosure, I do consult with lots of drug companies, but no one in particular.
Yeah. And you
And I
help
don't,
with the guidelines, to be clear. I mean, you help with the hormone guidelines.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate the work you're doing, and hope to see you at the menopause meeting in September.
I won't be there in September. You should come
Oh,
to the World Congress on the menopause in Melbourne.
oh, I should. That's in October.
Yeah, you should definitely come to that.
All right. Reason to go to Australia. Well, thank you very much, Professor Davis. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down and talk to mountain bike skills coach Karen Brooks. We had a great conversation about how skills coaching in any sport, really, can help midlife and menopausal women through the anxiety and fear many of us face during this time of life, as well as just have more fun and enjoy our active pursuits broadly. It's a great conversation, so come on back for that. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.